Hi, this is Jürgen Rasmussen. Welcome to the Provocative Hypnosis vlog. This vlog episode is about taking a fresh look at the so-called NLP presuppositions. So I have to say right off the bat, I spent quite a bit of time, about 5 or 6 years, having John Grinder as a sort of unofficial mentor, and he was pretty clear that he did not acknowledge the so-called NLP presuppositions as the NLP presuppositions. As far as I know, and I may be mistaken, the so-called NLP presuppositions have largely been pioneered by Robert Dilts and people around him in his network. So, but I will cover the so-called NLP presuppositions here and my take on them, a fresh look on them, since they very often in NLP trainings around the world are presented as the NLP presuppositions. So let's have a little look. Of course, these are just my opinions and my observations, but here we go. So a very common NLP presupposition is that there is no such thing as failure, only feedback. Now, this one has its uses. You know, a lot of people are scared of failure and they have a tendency to orient towards failure way too much. And by teaching them to think in terms of feedback instead of thinking in terms of failure, that can reduce a lot of performance anxiety and help a lot of people go for it a bit more and to become a bit more experimental. So I have seen that this orientation towards feedback versus thinking in terms of failure can be very useful. However, I also think it has its downside. On the one hand, it's kind of meaningless to talk about there being no such thing as failure and simultaneously talking about success or reaching goals or having positive outcomes. You know, one kind of presupposes the other. They kind of co-define each other and coexist as two sides of the same coin. So that is a bit hypocritical and a bit weird. And if we are talking about achieving a particular goal or a particular outcome within a particular time frame, then I think that it can be more useful to just label something as a failure, meaning to just own up to it and say that, you know what, that particular way of doing it or that particular strategy failed to get the outcome that I wanted. And I think that's more honest. And I think the main, say, reason in quotation marks why people are so afraid of failure is because instead of settling for, you know, just labeling the strategy or the behavior as a failure, they have a tendency to globally rate themselves based upon achieving their outcomes or not. So if they achieve an outcome, you know, if they win, they rate themselves as a winner. Or if they do good, they rate themselves as good, right? But vice versa, if they lose, they rate themselves as a loser. Or if they don't do good, they rate themselves as not good or not good enough. And as soon as you rate yourself globally as good enough or not good enough, you know, or as a winner or a loser or a good person or a bad person, based upon how you perform or the type of responses you get from people, then, you know, demands of succeeding and demands of approval and stuff like that will very often come up in your mind. And you'll be way more scared and neurotic than you otherwise would have to be. So what I would presuppose as more useful and more accurate is to say, look, you know, if you have a particular goal that you want to reach in a particular time frame and you failed to reach it, by all means, be honest about that and said, look, what I did didn't work, or I failed at that particular task. But stop there. Don't rate yourself as a failure. Rate your behaviors, rate your ways of thinking and ways of doing in terms of a particular outcome as good or bad or useful or not useful. But don't rate yourself at all. Don't rate yourself as a good person or a bad person. Unconditionally accept yourself. Just rate the behaviors and the ways of thinking. If you can do that, you'll be more honest and you'll be way less neurotic. So I think that kind of serves the intent and the consequence of there's no such thing as failure, only feedback, better, by saying, look, by all means do acknowledge failure, but don't rate yourself as either a failure or a success based upon your performance or based upon the responses that you get from other people. Here's another one that's very interesting. It's kind of like a double-edged sword, and that is the meaning of your communication is the response you get. The meaning of your communication is the response you get. This one's extremely useful to foster flexibility and creativity and increased perspective taking. So let's say that I'm an agent of change, which I am, or let's say that you're a teacher or a parent or something. And let's say that I say something that to me seems very clear and very obvious, and my client responds with disdain or confusion or anger. A lot of us have a tendency to think, well, I've said my piece, I've done my thing, and whether the person understands it or not, that's his limitation. But by adopting the idea that no, the meaning of your communication is the response you get, well, in this case, the meaning of my communication to that person was confusion. So I can then step back and go, okay, if I want to evoke something else than confusion or contempt or disdain or anger or whatever, what else can I do? Or if I give my wife a compliment or something that, looks like a compliment to me, and she snaps at me and gets offended and angry, I can go, okay, the meaning of my communication to her was some sort of insult. So if I want to insult her, I know what to do. Or if I want a different response, I can kind of step back and try something different to see if that kind of works to get the response. It's very, very interesting. Richard Bandler has made this point very often, that if you look at teachers, for example, as a group, there's a lot of talk about learning disabilities, that if a particular teacher stands in front of a room and presents information, and a certain percentage of people don't quite seem to get it, well, that means that there's some learning disability or some limitation within the student. Instead of perhaps opening for the idea that it could be a teaching disability or teaching limitation, meaning the teacher's saying something and it makes complete sense to the teacher, but to the student it's meaningless or nonsense. So the meaning of that response the meaning of that communication for the students is meaninglessness or nonsense. So the teacher who's willing to then step back and go, okay, that's what I'm evoking, that's the meaning for the particular student, what other framework, tools, ways of engaging, approaching this may I have, may turn into a more flexible communicator with increased perspective taking skills. So this is very useful. It also helps us to take things less personally. Now, this one also has a potential kind of catastrophic downside, especially these days in our current politically correct culture where people are competing based upon, group identities and identity politics, to be the most victimized and the most oppressed, and stuff like that. And these days, where increasingly we are seeing more and more restrictions on freedom of speech under the guise of hate speech laws, where what used to be, words like trauma and safety used to refer to physical trauma, something that may result in a brain injury, for example, and physical safety, where these days these concepts have become so watered down that for example, if someone feels provoked or challenged, or you challenge someone's beliefs, they can say that they're traumatized, or that they feel unsafe. Where violence, the term violence used to be referred to, physical acts of violence. Today, just having an opinion that someone doesn't like and expressing that opinion will very often result in people saying stuff like, well, I feel violated, or those opinions are an insult, or it's a violent attack on me and my group, and therefore you're an evil person, and therefore that should be banned. So if you take this too far, and if you put it in the hands of people with not that much perspective taking ability, it's one thing to say that, okay, the meaning of what you said to that person is this. But what's happening these days is that people start to take whatever they interpret something to mean, and they then attribute that intent to the other person. So let's say that you say something I don't like, or you challenge one of my cherished beliefs, for example. I feel offended. Well, I feel offended. That's evidence that you're a hateful person. And because you're a hateful person and I feel offended, you've done violence towards me. And you have now committed a hate crime, so to speak. So you should be punishable by law. And this is happening, in universities and in the States, for example. You can read a book called The Coddling of the American Mind by Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt, which is very good, on this topic. It talks about this particular type of mindset, and the trigger warnings and the microaggressions, and how students often no longer want free speech. In Europe, especially, criticizing Islam, criticizing the notions of multiculturalism, criticizing immigration policies. These have, in many places, been, disallowed, meaning that if you criticize these things, that's often a crime of hate speech towards a minority. So this is an extremely destructive way of thinking. And if you look at skilled agents of change, they may in their own mind be flexible and go, okay, what I just evoked from this person was anger. If I want to evoke something else, let's try something else. But what a good agent of change will help you do is to challenge what they in cognitive behavioral therapy call emotional reasoning. Namely, this idea that because I feel offended, that means that you meant to insult me, and that means that you're a horrible person, and you've committed violence towards me. Good agents of change will help someone to challenge those sorts of interpretations, and help someone to realize that what you're actually experiencing is your own interpretations, what you heard, and that's the source of your feelings. Unfortunately, what's happening these days in the media, among many academics, in our culture is that this type of emotional reasoning is being encouraged. A generation of young people are learning to think that way, and there is a correlation between that and the rampage of depression and anxiety and self-harming and suicide attempts that are riding high at the moment, compared to previous generations. There is something along those lines. So freedom of speech is under attack, and this type of mindset is contributing to it. What's also contributing to it is the idea that words are violence. And this can be a natural consequence of the meaning of your communication as the response you get. Because if you say something I don't like, if I get to interpret what that means, not only for me, but I get to interpret your intent, and I get to label it as criminal behavior, then we no longer have freedom of speech. We no longer have a society that fosters, intelligence and perspective taking and stuff like that. We'll end up with a society with increasingly offended people, less tolerant people, less intelligent people, more knee-jerk reactions, less perspective taking abilities. And unfortunately, there are many people in psychology, even in the NLP world and hypnosis world, that are kind of encouraging this idea of psychological trauma, and that words can be a form of violence. And it's often based upon an idea that, look, if I say something to you that you don't like, you may have increased cortisol levels. You'll be increasingly stressed, and if that occurs over time, you may be physically harmed by that. In the same way that if I hit you or did something to you, you could be physically harmed. Therefore, words are a form of violence. Or the neuroscience research that points in the direction of social isolation and social rejection kind of tending to light up a lot of the same neurology as physical pain, for example. And as a result of this, a lot of people start to then make the claim that it's essentially the same thing. But to do that, you have to exclude intent from the whole thing. So I'll quote something here, and this is from the book The Coddling of the American Mind by Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt. I highly recommend it. It's a really good book. And it's quoting Lisa Feldman Barrett, who's a very well-known psychologist and author. She's the author of the book How Emotions Are Made. And I think they tackle this particular mindset very, very well. So I'll just quote from it. So in a widely circulated essay in the New York Times in July 2017, the arguments that words can be violence was made by Lisa Feldman Barrett, a well-respected professor of psychology and emotion researcher at Northeastern University. Barrett offered this syllogism: if words can cause stress, and if prolonged stress can cause physical harm, then it seems that speech, at least certain types of speech, can be a form of violence. So here's Lukianoff and Haidt. We responded in an essay in The Atlantic in which we noted that it is a logical error to accept the claim that harm, even physical harm, is the same as violence. Barrett's syllogism takes the form that if A can cause B and B can cause C, then A can cause C. Therefore, if words can cause stress and stress can cause harm, then words can cause harm. But that does not establish that words are violence. It only establishes that words can result in harm, even physical harm, which we don't doubt. To see the difference, just return the syllogism by swapping in breaking up with your girlfriend or giving students a lot of homework. Both of these can provoke stress in someone else, including elevated levels of cortisol, and stress can cause harm, so both can cause harm. That doesn't mean that they are violent acts. Of course, one thing that they kind of exclude here is the idea that words, the idea that words directly cause stress is not really correct. It's the word, and it's how you make meaning of the word internally that generates the stress response. So there is no cause and effect relationship between a word and a stress response. The word has no inherent meaning. It's your interpretation, it's your projection of meaning onto the word that actually generates the response. So it's not even a causes B type of cause and effect relationship there. So this is extremely important. Couple of other NLP presuppositions, or alleged NLP presuppositions, that I'd like to cover here. One is the idea that every behavior has a positive intent. This one is usually very, very useful. In psychiatry and in a lot of kind of old psychology, the prevalent framework has been one of disease. That if someone acts weirdly or does something strange, then that has to mean that there's something wrong with them. But the frame that says, look, this may be a form of communication. This person may be attempting to communicate something. There might be some sort of intent here. What could it be? And can I help myself or someone else to achieve the same intent in better and more functional ways? This is a very, very useful framework, and I think for the most part a lot more useful than the illness framework, that something necessarily means that there's something wrong with you. Of course, a little caveat here, just to throw in, is perhaps we should say that every behavior has a positive intent for the person doing it, not necessarily for someone else. There are people out there, in the helping professions, there can often be a very fundamentally positive outlook, about human nature, about human beings being inherently good, inherently loving, that everyone's essentially good, at their core, stuff like that, which can be very useful assumptions, in working with people. However, there are people around you that are outright predatory and who have strong psychopathic tendencies, and sometimes strong narcissistic tendencies. And while they may have positive intents for themselves, it can be a good idea to also acknowledge that human nature is essentially a mixed bag. And this idea that everyone's nice and good, at their core, it's a nice idea, but it's probably not entirely true. So it's okay to kind of have some perspective on that. There's another presupposition, which is a really interesting one. It's kind of a double-edged sword again, and that is that everyone has the resources that they need. Everyone has the resources that they need. And I like this, positive, optimistic bias, because we very often don't know what someone may be able to do. Sometimes people can do miraculous stuff, and there's no test, there's no assessment, that could ever open up for something like that. It also encourages us to treat people as individuals instead of treating them as test scores or part of a group or fitting some personality profile or stage of development or something like that. Who knows what people may be able to do? I've had people stun me and shock me, in my career as an agent of change, in terms of changes they've been able to do. They're just so far outside of the scope of what I had been told or they had been told was possible. So having this as an orientation can be extremely, extremely useful. it's just also nice to kind of balance it, and also realize that, sometimes you can make a distinction here between capacity and potential. If you define potential as what someone may be able to do someday, and if you define capacity as what they're currently able to do, you could say that someone's potential is very limited, by genetic factors, and there's a limit to, how fast the human body can run, for example. But your capacity is per definition unlimited, meaning where you are in that you can work on it, all the time. So if we look at capacity, clearly people have different capacities. And I increased my results with clients, for example, when I really got that people weren't all equally, talented at hypnosis, for example, that people varied quite a bit in their hypnotic capacities. And I started to kind of design what I did based upon what seemed to be their capacities. Now, it's very hard to know what people's capacities actually are. So this isn't a perfect, assessment by any sense. But this idea that everyone can do everything and everyone's a great hypnotic subject, when I canned those ideas, my work got a lot easier. Also, in terms of like adult developmental psychology, some people clearly have more perspective taking than others. Some people's thinking is very black and white. It's extremely egocentric. There's no sense of a future. There's no sense of any personal responsibility. There's no real sense of ethics or any principled stance on anything. It's just opportunism and hedonism. Some people operate there. And then kind of at the other end of the scale, you have people with a lot of self-reflection, a lot of tolerance for ambiguity and paradox, and who can see shades of gray and who are quite response-able to, most of life's circumstances. And to pretend that everyone, for example, are equal in perspective-taking abilities, and to work with someone who doesn't have a lot of perspective-taking abilities, as if they had a lot of perspective-taking abilities, can really, really backfire. So it's kind of a great presupposition to have, but it's also important to kind of balance it and to hold it somewhat loosely. There are other so-called NLP presuppositions as well, but I think I'll stop here. I may or may not make a part 2. We'll see. If this sparks any insights for you, or any objections, or anything you kind of want to discuss, feel free to leave your comments wherever you find this particular video. If you want to work with me, if you're curious about the work I do, check out provocativehypnosis.com. Till next time, thank you.